Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take to kick off your week. Want to talk about the U.S.-China relationship. And, frankly, the Trump administration's, and President Trump in particular, his biggest foreign policy turnaround of this administration so far had been his views on Russia and Ukraine, which certainly continue to trend in a very different direction than the I'm going to get a deal done with Russia and end the war. But on China, the flip has been more dramatic, in part because this is the one area of policy that there has been really bipartisan alignment on, the desire to ensure that China is constrained and contained in areas of strategic competition where the Americans see China as an adversary. That's been the Trump 1 policy, the Biden policy. It's been Democrats and Republicans together in the House and Senate. Pretty much everyone feels the same way. And when Trump became president this time around, he put tough sanctions, tariffs on the Chinese. An additional 50%, another 50%, sort of 20% on the back of not cooperating on fentanyl, essentially a trade embargo. And his expectation, as was told to him by his economic advisors, is that the Chinese economy was in very bad shape, and therefore they would immediately cry uncle, they would capitulate, they would work to cut a great deal with Trump, and he would look like a hero. That, of course, didn't happen. The Xi Jinping saw that he could outlast President Trump, so he wasn't going to pick up the phone and try to engage. Instead, the Chinese responded with their own reciprocal tariffs. And also critically, they decided to use their point of maximum leverage against the Americans, which is critical minerals and rare earths. The Chinese are responsible for the production and the processing and the manufacturing of rare earths and heavy and light and other critical minerals that Americans and other companies around the world desperately need for their manufacture of goods, and particularly advanced goods. The military-industrial complex in the U.S. is utterly dependent on China for these minerals. So too the high-tech sector for artificial intelligence and the production of chips. The Chinese had not had an effective licensing regime, but they put it together very, very quickly, essentially mimicking what the Americans had been doing on semiconductors. And they stepped it up in a matter of months. And so suddenly you had a bunch of American CEOs going to Mar-a-Lago and saying, we're going to have companies and factories shutting down in red states if you don't find a way to get the Chinese to undo this new licensing regime, shutting down this choke point. Now, the Trump reaction has been quite astonishing. It's essentially unilateral disarmament on a key issue, which is that the Americans have decided to allow the Chinese access to the NVIDIA advanced H20 chip. Now, this is the choke point on China's lack of capacity to compete with the Americans in AI. The DeepSeek rollout, which is pretty much as capable as what the Americans have, was critically constrained by lack of availability of chips. And so therefore people couldn't use it. And their new R2 model has been delayed by months, same reason. And now suddenly the Trump administration has said, nope, you can have those chips. Nope, you can have software design. The things that the Americans were keeping the Chinese down, Trump is now saying it's fine as long as we can get our critical minerals. The Chinese are delighted that the Trump administration has climbed down. The Americans that are in the military-industrial complex are horrified that the Chinese now no longer have a constraint on being able to compete with and potentially dominate the Americans in this most important space. And I've been a little surprised that there hasn't been more outcry on that issue. I mean, the flip on Russia-Ukraine has been a flip that is generally aligned with the security complex in the United States and with most members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats. And so not going to be a lot of criticism there. Other American allies also aligned with where Trump is now trending on Russia-Ukraine. On China, this is giving away the store, right? This is suddenly Trump, who was seen as I'm the tough guy on China, capitulating on China. And if China is the principal adversary to the United States, by far the most capable, the Americans saying, we don't have the cards. You have the cards. The United States doesn't have the ability to get critical minerals and rare earths without China's assent. And this is easily as much of a vulnerability for the Americans as the decision to allow all of the semiconductor industry to be offshored to Taiwan over the past 20, 30 years, or the European decision to allow so much of their energy to be offshored to Russia through Nord Stream and other pipelines and infrastructure, and then suddenly realizing this is a real security problem. Well, the fact that the Americans require the Chinese to get minerals that they need in order to develop their military capabilities and their technology capabilities is a massive problem. And the Chinese have been working on this for decades because they understood that this was a competitive advantage. And the Americans were like, we'll let the Chinese do it because it's very, very dirty work. The resource exploitation has all of this negative environmental consequence. Much better to offshore that to a country like China or to countries in the global south like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where China has huge advantages. Also, China, of course, is not a market economy, so the subsidization of non-market forces to allow this production to occur is structural and massive for the United States, much less of that going on now. There is a huge priority now for the Americans to develop those capabilities, but this is not going to be done soon. With a lot of critical minerals, maybe 12, 18 months, there'll be good alternatives. But for light and specifically heavy rare earths, we're talking about probably 5 years or more. And that is a massive strategic advantage for China, one that we should be talking a lot more about. I think we're going to hear a lot more about it, but it does mean that ultimately the Americans are the ones capitulating. And compared to what we're seeing with other countries around the world, where they're the ones bending the knee, they're the ones that don't want to react because the Americans are much stronger, US-China is a very, very different story. That's it for me. I'll talk to you all real soon.